when we first talked about open science. The brief slogan then was, do we have the full story? Do we know about any other related studies? Do we know everything about this study, the method and what procedure was used, how the participants were recruited, and do we know the full details of the data analysis and preferably the full data? In this planning chapter, we say a little more about open science, then there'll be more in later chapters, especially in chapter 16. Here, the first thing we consider is the replication crisis and the very unfortunate finding that a number of studies that have set out to replicate published studies have found that they can't really do that. They find rather smaller effect sizes, as if the published studies have rather overestimated the true sizes of effects. A very famous argument was put forward by John Ioannidis in this medical journal with the wonderful title of Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Now, this might be overstating it a bit, and the article is a bit hard to read, but it has been downloaded 1 million or so times and very influential. The message is really quite simple. He claims that the underlying reason for the replication crisis is reliance on statistical significance, specifically the p less than 0.05 criterion. And many journals virtually require statistical significance before they'll publish anything, and many researchers believe that they've only succeeded if they get statistical significance. And Ioannidis argues that this imperative to achieve 0.05 underlies selective publication, the file drawer effect, which we saw in chapter 9. This has done so much damage to meta-analysis. If only some studies are available to us to put in the meta-analysis, then the meta-analysis is likely to overestimate the size of population effects. Point 2, if researchers feel it incredibly imperative to achieve 0.05, then they'll do a bit of selection and tweaking until they get a p-value sufficiently small. I'll say more about that in a moment. And third, if we take this 0.05 criterion as defining something as significant, almost as true as existing, well then we won't bother to replicate it. And in the past there's been very little incentive for researchers to replicate. Journals typically haven't published replications, and so few replications have been done. So these three reasons together, Ioannidis has argued, has led to this replication crisis. As if researchers have to bend over extremely far backwards just to get this 0.05, and that is the key to a PhD to tenure. Or to put it another way, the job is to sort out the very low p-values because they're the things that get published. I said I'd say a little about point 2, the data selection or tweaking. This famous paper from Psychology arguing that researchers actually have a lot of flexibility in data collection and analysis, and this might even allow just about anything to be shown to be statistically significant if you try hard enough. The statisticians have a saying, if you torture the data enough, they will confess. Now, the argument of Simmons et al. Is that as you conduct research, there are lots of decision points, and in each of these points, you need to make various choices. And if these choices are shaped by a desire to get a low p-value, then even if you start with more or less random data, then eventually you'll find something somewhere that can give you a very low p-value. These are questionable research practices, QRPs, or RDFs, researcher degrees of freedom, scope for researchers to make choices. It's easy to think about these as very positive and creative things to do. Researchers are typically smart and curious and ingenious, and they're very, very keen to find out how the world works, to find out how people work. And so they'll have an idea and they'll try things. Didn't quite work, so they'll try it a little differently. All looks more promising. Well, let's test a few extra participants. That's getting more promising. Now, this measure didn't really show things very clearly, but if we analyse slightly differently or we use a different measure, this is becoming clear. Now, we really need to drop these few outliers and try this slightly different statistical analysis. Very clear. Yes, we've got a nice clear result, a nice low p-value, and we'll publish a paper. Well, that needs to be recognised as excellent pilot testing, but not excellent research that deserves to be published. The trouble is that if you carry out these sorts of decisions after you see any of the data, you might simply be capitalising on chance. You might simply be cherry-picking, seeing faces in the clouds. And so the critical realisation that we have to have is to make a very clear distinction between pilot testing, where anything goes basically. Follow your nose, try things, vary until you get a nice clear result. Then use that to plan an excellent study, set out the procedure and the data analysis, and then pre-register that, then run the study following your pre-registered plan. Make sure that you make available to the world the results, whatever they are, even if they're disappointing, even if they're not what you expected. If you've done the research decently, then you must make them available so that they're available for future meta-analyses. That's a key realisation. The difference between exploratory research or pilot testing and then pre-registration and then carrying out the planned study following your pre-registered plan. Journals are beginning to pick up on this, and here is a famous editorial from the beginning of 2014 by Eric Ike, in which he makes very clear that we are changing things, business not as usual. From the start of 2014, this journal required of any authors submitting manuscripts that they had to make various statements that they'd revealed any data exclusions. They had to state that all the independent variables and all the relevant dependent variables had been reported. So that was the sort of requirement part of the new policy. Then there was the reward policy. If authors went further and followed desirable open science practices, they were rewarded with these badges on their articles. The open materials badge for stating in full the materials used, the procedure used, so that somebody else could replicate that study, and then the open data badge if at the end you made the full data publicly available in some archival permanent way, and then the pre-registered badge, red, the especially important one, if the study had been pre-registered before the data were collected and then conducted in accord with that pre-registered plan. And if you look at psychological science and an increasing number of journals, you'll find a few cases of pre-registered badges and increasing numbers of these other two. And finally, in this editorial was a statement embracing the new statistics, encouraging researchers to use estimation and meta-analysis as a way to avoid some of the problems of NHST. The Association for Psychological Science, which publishes this top journal, Psychological Science, is very encouraging for other journals to follow similarly. Yes, stand up there and show the world your methods and your data. More recently, the next editor-in-chief of Psychological Science, Steve Lindsay, at the end of 2015, published another very well-known editorial talking about policies in psychological science to encourage replication and to encourage publication of findings that were themselves replicable, that would be found reliable if replicated. He made a couple of very important statements. Here he says, personally, I aim never again to submit for publication a study that hadn't been pre-registered. And further, I'm requiring my students to do that as well. So if in your student group you are planning a study, you should think very seriously about whether you can pre-register it. And if you possibly can, you should do that. Also recognise that maybe for your teachers and for other people you discuss research with in whatever discipline you're working in, it might be rather new to pre-register a study, and you might need to discuss the reasons for it. But as with all of open science, recognise that if you're following this argument and you're doing your best to earn these badges, then you are right up at the forefront of good scientific practice. Well done to you. The Open Science Framework, this wonderful online resource that is supported and developed by the Centre for Open Science, gives you all sorts of wonderful facilities for managing your research, documenting the decisions you make, the materials you use, and pre-registering, if you wish, your detailed research plans. You can start off even without them being public, just registered with a date stamp on them, and you can make them public later if you wish. Much better if you do. Other people can see them and maybe give you some great feedback. And after you've run your study and analysed your data, you can then make publicly available via OSF your full data set and details of your analysis. So this is the new way to do science that should improve greatly the replicability, the trustworthiness of the research literature. It's the way to escape the alligators of the Ioannidis problems, largely brought about by the O5 imperative. So enjoy sailing in the OSF balloon.